Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. And for those watching the recording, thank you as always for tuning in and being part of our community. Today, we have a really interesting guest, a really accomplished engineer, and a really interesting founder working in the open source space with a really fascinating story that led him to where he is today. We're grateful for his time. Viren, thanks so much for joining us. I'll pass the mic to you. I would love to maybe have you provide a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll dive into some questions together. But thanks so much for joining the DevLake chat today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me. Absolutely. Yeah. So, and thanks for the kind of early introduction. Yeah, as kind of you mentioned, right? Like, my name is Viren. I'm one of the founders and CTO at Orkes. Orkes essentially is a company with a mission to bring a conductor, which is an orchestration platform built at Netflix when I was at Netflix on as a cloud hosted service. But that's just the kind of beginning. Our mission is kind of beyond that, like in terms of focusing on developer space. How do we enable developers to build applications in the cloud with all the everything that comes with building things in cloud and everything that you would need in building an application, right? Resiliency, scalability, and other aspects of it at the same time without investing too much of your time. But really, before starting Orkes, I spent a few years at Google working on Firebase, where I led a product team. And before that, I spent time at Netflix doing similar stuff. Before that, I was at Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs was interesting because, even though you would think about it as a kind of a bank, but when it comes to investment banks, they tend to be leader in terms of the technology. And one of the side effect of that essentially also is a lot of stuff that they use is built in-house. So, again, there I was responsible for a distributed data processing system, something that you would do today with maybe a combination of Dexter and some sort of dependency management as well as a distributed data processing framework. But yeah, I have spent the last decade working with developers as my users and customers. And I think overall, I love the space. It's just a lot more rewarding, fulfilling, working for other engineers and helping them kind of, build the applications and platforms.
Absolutely. No, that's really, really cool. And I appreciate the background, and it kind of transitions us really nicely into the first question I have for you, Viren, which I always love to find out. I feel like the open source universe, so many different types of people find their way into it. And I feel like no two stories are the same. I'm curious, what was it that got you into open source? What was that journey like, and where did you begin, and how did you get to where you are today, which is a founder of a company that's focused on building, open source technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I open source Conductor, the thought was not that, hey, I'm going to start a company around this one day. And the primary motivation for open sourcing something that was completely built internally and was used internally was that, like, we use a lot of stuff from open source, right? Like more than half of our stack, actually the entire stack that we were using at Netflix was built on open source product. Even our CI/CD, for example, Spinnaker had been open source by then. So the question always was that, like, hey, we have built something, we have seen a lot of adoption inside the company. We see it's a pretty general purpose thing. And there is no secret sauce here, right? Like Conductor is not something that is a secret technology for Netflix to do streaming or studio productions, right? Like, so, in terms of, there isn't a business risk associated with this. And so, it kind of cleared the path for open sourcing it. Now, the question is that why do you open source something, right? Like, and I think back then the motivations were twofold, right? One was that once you open source something, it gets the community love, right? Like if your product is really good, you suddenly find yourself working with other engineers across the globe who are also contributing to the product. And it overall kind of helps improve the product, right? Like you essentially get this entire mindshare of developers. I mean, it's less about code contribution, more about the mindshare, right? Like people asking questions, people trying to use in different scenarios. It kind of expands your horizon and how you build the product. Second was a little more selfishly, right? It was a collateral for hiring. And by then, I was already kind of managing a team, and the idea was, if I go to a candidate, and we live in an interesting world, right, where even with today's situation, it is still very much the market for engineers, right? Like you end up with multiple offers. The question always comes is that why should I join your team, right? And having a collateral, which is an open source product, always was good. So those were kind of the primary motivation back then. In hindsight, I think the first one turned out to be much better. Like, in terms of the community mindshare, I think Conductor has evolved the way it does, mainly because of the community. I think it would have taken a very different shape if it was a purely internal tool.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think that's a really interesting way to capture like two distinct values of open source, and I certainly agree. I think it's really exciting to think about what this paradigm generally means, where any great product is, of course, driven by end user feedback. But if you're essentially short-circuiting that connection point where the end users don't just have to provide the feedback and then that goes to a product manager, goes to an engineering team, but the end users can in fact raise the issue themselves or even work on the code directly. There's no greater way for that feedback to translate into production, so effectively, which is very exciting. And I think it's also a really interesting point that perhaps some people in some of these legacy companies, especially, perhaps underappreciate the value of figuring out, what technology isn't necessarily core to the business that could really kind of establish, credibility and brand and visibility, so that you can also become, a recruiting powerhouse and bring in the best developers, which I imagine is always a challenge for every company forever.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's one more thing to it, right? Like typically companies always promote the culture of or good ones definitely do that, right? Like is that, everybody can contribute to the product. Like internally you encourage people to send, pull requests, patches. That typically never happens because, why would I submit a patch to a product or a system that is responsibility for some platform team in the company, right? But the moment the product is open source, I think the equation changes, because you are no longer submitting a patch or a pull request to a product maintained by a team, but rather maintained by a community, right? And then you become part of that community and start to get the ownership, right? Like the sense of ownership changes. You go from being purely a user of a product to kind of essentially a part of the product. And that dynamic is really interesting because, when there is a bug, they don't wait for you to go and fix it. They will fix it themselves. So in a way, it also encourages kind of this collaborative within the company, even though it's an open source product. Like it just shifts something in your mind.
Yeah, exactly. No, I completely agree. And it's the topic of hiring and recruiting, kind of moves nicely into another question that I had, which I was really curious to dive into. You've of course worked for perhaps some of the most well-reputed brands in the world, certainly some of the most visible and well-known, all three being kind of engineering powerhouses. I imagine many younger developers, especially those listening to the recording and joining us today, are wondering, what does it take to get the attention of some of these blue chip brands? And as someone who's been in there, what were some of the things that you would look for when you were assessing new teammates or new talent to join your teams?
I think that's a great question. Like, what does it take to get into, for example, FANG, right, or investment banking and things like that? I mean, especially when you think about the tech companies, they focus a lot more on like, I would say, sometimes you get a ton of resumes. How do you kind of differentiate and decide, or which one catches your eye, right? Like saying, this is the person that we should talk to. And open source contributions definitely matters most, right? Nothing can speak louder than the code that you have written, right? If I can see your code and see, hey, this person has written so much of code, this person is an active contributor to this project, it's just a no-brainer at that point of time where whether you should interview the person or not. You should definitely interview the person. You don't even have to sometimes, take the coding round. You can just look at their code and see, does it make sense? Does it fit your style, the way you or your team works, right? How are they communicating? Because open source is not just about, sitting in a dark room, writing the code and sending a pull request. You are also communicating with the fellow engineers, sometimes getting into discussions about how do you implement certain things, whether you should implement certain things. Is this a feature or a bug? How do you respond to those things? I think those things also come out very nicely in those aspects. So in some ways, it speaks louder than your kind of resume on a Google Doc or a PDF, your code. So that's one thing that definitely stands out. And the second part essentially is, the kind of projects or other things that you worked on, right? Like, I think in the end, depending upon the kind of role that you are hiring for, more junior role, I think it can be more generalist, right? But more senior people you want to hire, you probably want to hire somebody who can hit the ground running pretty quickly, which means they understand the problem space or the business that you are in. So that's the another thing that really matters, I guess.
Yeah, no, that definitely mirrors, some of the conversations I've had recently. Most recently with the creator of Homebrew, he had a very similar sentiment where he talked about, let the code speak for itself. And if he's hiring somebody, he would much rather take a look at their contributions to relevant open source, projects. And, if he's impressed by that, he basically just needs to interview them to figure out if they're going to be able to communicate and be a general kind of culture fit, right? Be a good member of the team, but kind of clearing those tech, barriers through those open source contributions can make the conversation much more about who you are as a person, rather than dealing with the kind of checkboxes of technical, competency or experience, which is super interesting. And I do feel like more and more developers, especially the young ones, are starting to really see this. That's certainly been my experience where, in our own community, we've seen so many motivated, like college students and recent graduates who are diving deep into the repo, getting their hands dirty with the code. And you can tell that they understand that it really is mutually beneficial, where they can help a project that they care about, but they also understand that if they're making meaningful contribution, that's going to pay dividends in their own career. And I think there's a really kind of virtuous cycle at play there, which is so exciting to see.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm curious, Viren, you're in an interesting dynamic in many ways, and one that's at least unique to me, as far as I haven't seen anyone else in the position you are, where you went from being kind of a creator and maintainer of a technology that was created in-house and open sourced. And then your next step was to go and found a company that was working with that. And I'm curious, what has that transition been like? What have been some of the challenges as far as kind of transitioning from maybe somebody that had, control over probably everything, or at least kind of visibility into everything, to someone who is, still influential and making significant contributions, but perhaps has less control over maybe what gets, pushed forward into production. I'm curious what that has been like. What have the big challenges been?
I think when you think about it, right, like if you own the project and if you have kind of full rights to the project, in some ways it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, one is that, like, no, you have ability to kind of go and just commit whatever you want, or do whatever you want to do. On the other hand, I think well-run open source projects typically run not that way, but rather through kind of a well-defined process. Like we see that with Apache, for example, right? Like you have PMC, a project management committee, and decisions are not made by one individual, but rather by a committee. So in some ways, even though Conductor today is not part of Apache or a similar foundation, it kind of runs similarly, right? Like ideas get vetted by kind of the major committers, what makes sense. code gets reviewed, design gets reviewed as well. So in some ways it makes the process very democratic, and it's like, so in a way that kind of builds kind of a rigor that you would want in an open source, because a lot of time what you see is that there is an open source project. It is open source for the namesake because for example, a company wanted to make it open source so they can have some sort of recruitment collateral, for example, out of it, right? But if you don't have outside contributors actively contributing to the discussions and features and what goes in and what doesn't go in, I think eventually it just becomes like a vanity ware, right? Which is essentially committed by the company and only the company uses, nobody else. But in some ways, having this kind of a thing also helps, because now community sees that, like, hey, this is not just maintained by one or two people who works at the company, but also outside contributors who are actively participating in it. So I think in a way, you could think about it as a challenge, but the way I would like to think about it is, it's a good process in the end. And typically, sometimes it also depends upon the company, right? If they have a DNA of working on building open source project, which Netflix certainly has, right? Like when you look at the Netflix GitHub repo, pretty much a lot of stuff they have done has been open source. So, I mean, you end up working with people who are culturally minded from that perspective. So it makes overall things much easier. But I mean, I can talk about other challenges, right? Like there is more than just that in terms of just forming a company, because you go from purely a maintainer of a project to a builder of a company. And these are two different things altogether, right? Like in some ways they are equally hard, but building a company is exponentially hard.
Yeah, no, I imagine in many ways being a maintainer also probably prepared you quite well for being a founder, where that's been one of the common sentiments that I've found with many leading maintainers is the challenge of recognizing that it's so much more than code, right? It's customer service, it's branding, it's product management, it's product strategy, it's graphic design sometimes. Like there's a little bit of everything, and I imagine that experience perhaps prepared you quite nicely for stepping into the role of founder, and it probably felt quite familiar. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it resonates very well, right? Like when you are maintaining an open source project and when you are responsible, right? Like you're not just writing code for it. You are also actively deciding and working on the product roadmap strategies. And I think open source in some ways is also a lot more about, building the community, which is essentially, nice way to say that, how do you market the product, right? So, you are also wearing different hats. And this is especially true unless you are building a product that is kind of a unicorn, which you just put it out and then suddenly 100,000 people download the product. You have to do the work, right? Like if you look at Kubernetes or Docker, in early days, people who built it spend a lot of time talking in conferences and writing articles and doing all the stuff to build the community around it. So you have to do that regardless, right? And in some ways, these things just translates one-on-one. Like when you're building a company, you have to do those things as well, and of course other things. But in some ways, like it gives you a very good sense of like what it would be like if you were to go and build a company around this product. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it makes great sense to me. I certainly agree with all of that. And you touched upon an interesting point, Viren, that brings us to our next question quite nicely. So you mentioned that, a kind of critical piece of figuring out whether or not a open source project has truly become like open source rather than just in name, if it's picked up some outside contributors and if it started to kind of build a community. And I certainly agree with that. I'm curious for you, when you're kind of assessing the health or the performance of, a repo or a community or an open source project, what kind of things come to mind for you? Like what are you looking for to determine whether or not this open source project is performing strong? And my follow-up question after that, I'd love to kind of hear your perspective from both that open source perspective and the closed source perspective. So like, what are you looking for to determine whether or not an open source project is performing or is solid? And then from a closed source perspective, what were the kinds of things that you would look at when you were working on something internal? I would love to dive into that together.
I think this is an excellent question. Like when you think about open source project, right? Like there are like straightforward kind of metrics that you look into it, right? To see if this project, how healthy this project is, right? Like, and I look at it in two ways, right? One is how active the project is in terms of, new releases being created. Like, if you see a release created once every 6 months or a year, the project is kind of in some sort of a dormant life cycle, right? Like, even though it could have 100,000 GitHub stars, most likely this project is not going anywhere anymore. So that's one thing. But like, on the other hand, let's say you could have 3 or 4 engineers working on a project, constantly, committing the code and, creating releases every, let's say, a week. It doesn't necessarily mean that, from the open source perspective, it's in a healthy shape, because, it could be just those 4 people doing something on that one, right? And nobody else. So the other aspect, which I think is a lot more indicator, is like how active the community is around the project, right? But the question is, how do you measure the activeness of the community? And I would think about it in 2 ways, right? Like one is, how many issues communities are creating. I mean, if there is a project with no issues and no bugs, probably there's nothing happening on that project, right? So chances are that there is always something new. And this doesn't have to be necessarily bugs, right? It could be feature requests, it could be questions, the active discussions. Those are all good signs of a healthy community, that they are engaged. And that clearly shows there's an inbound interest, right? People trying to use the product, having questions, finding bugs and whatever not. The second question is that for a community to be healthy, right? Is it purely a consumer and a producer relationship where, like, somebody is writing the code, doing all the service for them, and they're just consuming and sending the community has to be active, right? They have to be both consumer and a producer. So second question then I would like to find out is essentially, when there are questions, is the community helping each other instead of just the maintainers, right? Like ideally you want to be in a state where the maintainers are only chiming in when there is a really deep technical question that maybe only they are positioned to kind of answer, but the community should be self-sustained from that perspective. And even from the commit, and that goes to one more thing, right, which is that how often the community contributes the code, pull request and features. Like I think when you see a project where, like, all of these things are happening, you can immediately see that the community is pretty active. Like it doesn't have to be at that point of time used by 10 million developers, right? Let's say even if it is used by 100 developers, but if they are very engaged, I would say it's a very active open source project, and it's pretty healthy from that perspective. It's quite possible the product, like a lot of times people look at the GitHub stars, for example, right, as a health, but then the perils of that or downside to that is that, like, unless the project is very broadly applicable, you are not going to get that many stars, right? So I would rather look at the other side of the community engagement, and that would be a very good indicator of a healthy community. Now this is for open source side, but like when you think about internal projects, I think you could apply similar metric, but I think the expectation there is not that people might contribute back to you, because everybody has a job in the company and primary responsibility. So I think there again, the health is, it takes the community equation out, but like how often you are creating a releases, new features, like bug fixes are kind of given that it will get fixed, right? If somebody finds a bug, somebody has to fix it. That's the company's thing. But is it undergoing new active development, right? Like, is it constantly getting updated? Other thing is, the frameworks are typically changing every few years. Like, is the product getting updated with those new paradigms if required, and things like that, right? So like some of the things that matters, you want to see it inside a project.
Yeah, no, I think those are really great points, and I loved that point that you made about this kind of balance between consumer and producer, and how unilateral that relationship is, where I think you see so many projects that are, especially those that are contributors are only in a certain company, and all of the users are from a certain cohort, and there isn't any of that exchange happening. So even if it's open source in name, you could argue perhaps it isn't open source in truth, where it's simply a transparent, traditional SaaS model in some ways. So I think that balance is so critical and probably a big part of great community management for any of these kinds of technologies.
Yep. Yes.
And I'm interested, Viren, so those are great kind of things to be looking at for open source projects. And I think many, are ones that we think about all the time here at DevLake, and of course, as users of Orbit, and I know we're both users of Orbit as well. I'm curious, when you kind of shift gears into, your previous roles working on closed source teams, what were some of the things that you would kind of look for there? I'm interested, kind of what does kind of a team leader or a manager in those settings, what are the kinds of things that they're thinking about or looking for to maybe sit down at the end of the week and say, this was a bad week or this was a great week, and figuring out what that actually means? I'm curious kind of what things you would look at and think about.
I think to me, that comes down to, or boils down to, two things, right? Like, one is the product. And I'll talk about more from the product perspective, because that's what typically I have done. So one is like, how is your product doing, right? And any product metrics that you are tracking. Along with that, like, this could be DAUs, 70 active users, monetization, overall product health, like, if you had a downtime associated with it, or an incident, just purely kind of from that perspective, right? And that is more, in my opinion, kind of in some ways kind of retroactive, right? Like, this is what happened. Second is purely from the product perspective, what is it that you plan to do? What are your small bets and big bets? And I would say small bets are essentially something that you have tested it from the market perspective, from the product requirement perspective, and it's going to work. You just need to find time to kind of build it, but it's not going to kind of significantly change something in the product. Then there are big bets where, like, you are not too sure about whether this is a worthwhile investment or not, but you are taking a bet because you are investing in some future kind of roadmap there, or trying to build a new product and things like that. So, like, you are looking at in terms of what bets you want to place, how things are kind of going with those, and I think those are the things with respect to product. Now, product does not exist in isolation. We are not there yet where the computer is writing the code. So the second part is basically people. Like, how is your team doing? And in some sense, without a team, there's no product. So I would rather kind of flip the order and say, first focus on people, to say, hey, how is the team doing in terms of the team dynamics, right? Are people happy? Are they really enjoying the work? Because it's true that you got to do what you got to do, but if you can always find ways to make it more interesting and challenging for people, and find the right motivation, right? Like, when you think about a team, and especially in larger the company goes, you end up with people with a very diverse set of interests and backgrounds, and everybody has a different motivation as to why they are in the team. Let's say someone who is in your team, their primary motivation is to learn more about technologies and building big scale things, and all they are doing is bug fixes. I think they are not going to be very happy about it, even though they might be really good about it. Or there could be somebody who is more interested in making sure the product is healthy more than anything else, and then you ask them to kind of focus more on big picture things. They are not going to be happy either, and you probably want to switch that assignment, right, to make sure that they are equally happy and you still get the job done in the end. So the people aspect is really important, in my opinion, and there are different ways to measure it, right? Like, your one-on-ones tells you very clearly what's going on. Are people kind of progressing in their career? Are they meeting their kind of expectations from the job, from the team? You don't measure that every day, but at least once few weeks, maybe a quarter. It's a good place to be in, like, when the team is healthy, when they are happy, right?
Yeah, no, I love that point that you made, that you can kind of think about leadership in a kind of engineering and kind of product development perspective in those two categories, really thinking about, like, what are the kind of top level signals that you're looking for that indicate okay, the product is healthy. And then also understanding that, healthy, happy people are going to build healthy, happy code. And if you're taking care of them and thinking proactively about how to keep them motivated, how to keep them engaged, that you can have some faith that they're going to deliver good results if you're taking care of those things. And I think that's something probably everyone can relate to, where, they've maybe had a really bad week or a bad month, and their work reflects that, right? Like maybe they're less productive, maybe they're less creative, or maybe they're working more slowly. And then you have the other side where you're really happy, you're really rested, you're really energized, and it shows in your work where everything is just a little bit better. So I think that's a great way to think about it. Really kind of focusing on the inputs and the outputs, and trusting that the kind of process in between those things will ultimately, be managed if you're taking care of those kind of critical endpoints, basically.
Yep, absolutely.
So a question I would like to kind of lead into a little bit based off of that is, I imagine it was probably quite different to all of the different companies that you've worked at, but it's probably a mystery to many who haven't worked in these kinds of organizations. Like, what does kind of a week in the life of an engineer at these companies look like, at least from your experience? Like, I imagine some people imagine it's like all like heads down in code, and perhaps others think it's nothing but whiteboard sessions. But I'm curious, kind of, and maybe just pick one. But I'd love to kind of get that insight of like what was a week in the life like for Viren at one of your favorite engineering roles.
Interesting. Like, interestingly, I had 3 different roles at 3 different companies. Like Goldman Sachs, I was primarily an individual contributor. Netflix was an IC plus, in some sense, like a product manager for Conductor, and then eventually people manager. Google, I was purely a people manager and focusing on product and people. But in general, like, if you look at the kind of companies who are into pure tech, right, like Netflix, Google, like when you think about the life of an engineer, right, like and when I look back my team, how they would be spending their entire week, I think in some sense there's no general categorization. I think it varies depending upon your exact role in the team and your kind of seniority as well, right? Like and the way it tends to kind of work is that more junior you are, you tend to be focusing a lot more on code, because you have very well defined scoped task in terms of what needs to be achieved, and you focus on that, right? But the reality of software development is that, like, you're not writing a new algorithm every day, right? You're not doing whiteboarding every day. Yes, you do whiteboarding when there is a problem that you are trying to solve. So and that typically is limited or rather kind of focused on more about, I have this problem that we need to solve, and this problem doesn't have to be an engineering problem, right? It could also be a non-engineering problem in terms of we need to reduce our or we need to increase our availability, right? Or reduce the number of incidents, like, what are the ideas? And, you just go on a whiteboard, start doing some stuff there. But one thing that is very consistent across all the teams is, you typically have a stand-up. Most teams do follow Scrum-like model, right? Like you meet in the morning, few minutes, just to discuss, like, what did you do, what your plan is, like regular typical Scrum stuff, right? I would say more senior you go, more meetings you tend to be part of. Like I would think that, so, like, junior you are spending a lot more time on writing code, and then it starts to kind of graduate from that to also helping other people, like, who gives them the well-defined specs, right? Another engineer who is slightly more senior, who is breaking down the product requirements into specs. So probably the lead engineer, who is kind of responsible, directly working with their, the manager as well as the product people. You are spending a lot of time in code review. Everybody does the code review. It's a very democratic system from that perspective, right? anybody can review anybody's code, and typically that's healthy as well. That's part of the healthy team as well, right? You don't have hierarchies in the teams. I should have mentioned that earlier. So you spend the time writing code, debugging things, right? Like something is not working, why it's not working. It could take 3 days to find out the 3 lines of code which was causing issues. So a lot of times people come into software engineering thinking the whole day they are going to be writing some interesting code, solving problems, trying to bring down everything to log n or o(n) complexity. In reality, they're just chasing null pointer exceptions to see where is this coming from, why this database is slow. And sometimes it feels like it's a pretty mundane task, but that's what sometimes is required. Or just trying to figure out the complex web of interconnected systems to say, I need to send out an email. What's the best way to do it? Like, somebody has a service, but who is that team? How do I use it? Those things, right? Like a lot of logistics you spend time on, but it can be quite interesting, yes, depending upon how you look at it.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. And I like that perspective too, of kind of recognizing that great work doesn't have to be nonstop code output, right? It can also be, all of the thought, all of the research, all of the discussion, all of the strategy that goes into either debugging something that's a mystery or extremely challenging, or really kind of strategizing and architecting a feature in the right way before building, right? Making sure that you're creating that blueprint that's going to, reduce the chances of problems down the line, and is something that's scalable and easy for other developers to work on, and is unlikely to break the existing code. So I think that's a really great way to look at it. So I'm curious, Viren, you've accomplished a lot in your career, and now you're a founder. I'm curious if you were to kind of jump into a time machine and kind of give yourself advice when you were starting out, or maybe you were to meet a young developer who was in your shoes, beginning their career. What are the kind of things that maybe you wish you knew when you got started, or advice you would want to give a young developer that maybe looks at your career path and goes like, man, I would love to do the things that Viren has done. I would love to accomplish the things he's done and work at those companies. What general advice would you give that person?
I think I can't like one thing that is very understated and like often overlooked is the power of kind of networking. Because when you think about it, right, as you asked earlier also, right, like when you are hiring, what you look for, right? What if when you are hiring and you already know people that might be, and typically, you reach out to people, right? Hey, I'm hiring for this role. If you have recommendations, right? How do you know which company is good to work at? Like, what are the interesting projects, right? And networking, whichever area you have, right? Like you are in West Coast, East Coast, London, in India, in China, Singapore, wherever you might be, right? I think networking is really important. I think I didn't realize that until very late, until, as a matter of fact, until I joined Goldman Sachs, where they do stress this and always tell you upfront in your orientation that this is the #1 important thing. Like the best advice that I got was that when I joined Goldman Sachs, one thing that I was told that kind of stuck with me was that the most important time in your day, once you join the firm, is going to be the coffee time. That time when you go out and or go to the cafeteria and get the coffee. And the reason they said is that that's the time where you go to see the people, and that's when you network, and that's going to go a long way in your career, more than anything else, more than the amount of code that you write or projects that you work on. That networking is going to be the single most important thing that's going to make you successful at the firm. And in some ways that's true for Goldman Sachs also, because they are in that kind of a business. But I think it's broadly applicable to everyone, right? Like beyond just working on a project. I think expanding your network tremendously helps, not in terms of kind of finding out who is hiring, who is doing what, but also understanding what's happening in the industry, right? Like what new things are coming up, what interesting problems that people are solving. It just opens up your horizon, expands your network. So that's one thing. I think I can't stress that enough. That's really important. Second, I think is, if you look at it, right, like you might think this is kind of given and people already know this, but like you'll be surprised that like a lot of times people don't take this very seriously, which is, you are in this field where software development is interesting, right? Things change every few years. And most successful developers that I've seen, or good ones at least, right, they have worked across different stacks, right? Like if you just think yourself as like, I'm only going to focus on front end and I only do React and nothing else, or I only do backend stuff, I think you are just pinholing yourself into one area, and you forget, let's say, you could be a very good backend developer, but have you noticed what kind of design patterns people use when they do React development, right? Like you could potentially learn from that, bring it back, right? Like, so exploring different stacks, how do you build a mobile application is very different from how do you build a backend system, right? It's purely from the communication, right? Like if you were thinking that, no, my network in data center is unreliable, think about the mobile phone network, right? It is extremely unreliable, and you don't even know your users, right? Like, and it's like, if you love uncertainty, I think there's nothing better than doing mobile app development in some ways, right? Or building frameworks for that. But experimenting with different things, I think, even though you may not be working on it at your company, I think is definitely expands your horizon, right? And sometimes you might find your niche there, right? Like that's what you like, and maybe you change that. So I think these are the two things I would say I found to be very useful.
Love it. Yeah, I completely agree, and I appreciate that those are both simple and actionable, for anybody to engage on, whether they're at the beginning of their career or already quite senior. And I certainly agree, that those have been my experiences also as I've kind of grown through my career, is understanding to value those things appropriately. So Viren, I know we're towards the end of our time. We have one question from the audience that if you're up for jumping in, we'll do one. And this is one from our special guest, Hajong, who's our co-founder and CTO, who put this question in. So I'll summarize it for those who can't see it. But Hajong asks, I'm always curious how others balance the work between technical contribution, things like defining the roadmap, writing code yourself as the maintainer, reviewing PRs, all of that side of the work on open source. How do you balance that with the community building side of things, where you're maybe talking to the members of your community, you're answering questions, you're going and doing public speaking or organizing meetups? So Hajong's question is, for you personally, what's your kind of philosophy on that, and how do you think about maintaining that balance in addressing both sides of it?
I think that's an interesting question, and to be honest, like if I say that I have an answer that works and this is the right answer, I would be wrong. But to me, I think when you think about the open source, right, like the main reason why you open source something or why you get into open source is because you really want to see the community adoption and building the community around it. So I think to me that should be the number one priority in terms of helping the community, right? The way I see is that, like, if you are the founder and a maintainer of an open source project, your role at some point of time shifts from being the active contributor, committer, and the owner of the project to the helper of the community, right? Like people have questions, and sometimes this could be very rudimentary questions, right? Like but navigating through those, helping them out, I think that goes a long way. And trying to find, like, to me, I'm spending less time in terms of what next feature that I want to build, because if your community is healthy, they are going to tell you what feature they want, and then you can have a backlog of features, and then you can prioritize and say what makes sense. So it some ways makes your life much easier. But how do you get the community to be there, like that healthy community that we talked about earlier? I think that, in my opinion, is my number one priority, that how do I get that community to be healthy? And one thing that comes out of it is essentially, do I see the sense of ownership inside the community, right? The moment they start owning the project or have a sense of ownership, it will explode, right? Like we all look for that hockey stick graph. And I think the key to that graph is that community ownership or sense of ownership inside the community. So I would say, number one priority is the community. Number two is product, because it's also very easy to end up in a project which is basically a whole bunch of different features, but no cohesive, coherent story. So I think as an owner, it's your responsibility to ensure that you keep the project true to its nature, right? Like if it is supposed to do X, you don't start doing Y. Maybe start a new project for doing that. So that's the other part. And then final piece is ensuring the code contributions are healthy and all right. But like if you have an active community, you can almost be assured that somebody in the community will take care of that, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think it's a great philosophy to have, that if you're prioritizing the community first, the rest should naturally follow, which is, I think, the spirit of open source.
Yeah.
Viren, I know we're at our time here, we're a little beyond it. So I'm so grateful that you joined us today. And I think this discussion and the recording and the blog that will come from this is going to be so insightful for many of our community members. I'm pasting in the chat here for anyone listening right now, the Slack invite to join the DevLake community. We'll always be posting recordings and blogs there first before sharing it elsewhere. Do feel free to join us, even if you're not necessarily interested in DevLake itself. I think we have a great community of many talented developers around the world, so we welcome you to join that. Viren, is kind of a final send-off here. Where can people find your work? Where can they connect with you? And do you have any kind of asks of the audience to join in or follow you anywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are very active on, like, if you go to orkes.io, orkes.io, you can find the links to join our Slack community. And search for GitHub on GitHub, right? Netflix Conductor. I would highly recommend, if you can start the repo, definitely that helps. And feel free to give it a try and reach out with any questions. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll certainly be including all of those links in the YouTube video in the bio, and we'll make sure to share them in the community so people can jump in. Certainly the Orkes team, everyone I've spoken with there has been so wonderful to collaborate with, and we're certainly excited to see how we can continue our collaborations with you, Viren, on both a personal level and on a professional level.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for those tuning into the recording. Thank you, Viren, for your time today. As always, we'll see you on the Slack, and we'll look forward to our next session. We'll be doing a Twitter Spaces next week, and we'll be promoting that shortly. You'll see who we're chatting with. And then as always, we'll look forward to seeing you on our next open source huddle. So Viren, thanks so much. And to everyone tuning in, thank you as always, and bye for now.
Yeah, thank you.